before we dive into our new area, I wanted to review assignment 1 a little bit. I will be getting back your graded assignments toward the end of the week. But I ran into a few areas where there was some confusion, especially regarding the issue. So I wanted to make sure to address that now. So as you're working on assignment 2, hopefully there will be less confusion. So I have the issue here. This is actually a copy of assignment 1 right up there. And there were a couple of ways that folks went a little bit astray, off topic, some of which is understandable. So first sentence, your client is victim of identity theft. So this is not a question of identity theft. Your client does not want to hold Facebook accountable for criminal identity theft. She was a victim of it by some other perpetrator or culprit, as I call them in the hypothetical. So some of you used identity theft as your search term, which is okay as long as when you were looking in your results, you weren't focusing on the criminal aspect of it, but you were focusing on the deceptive business practices aspect. Because again, as you see, that what she wants to hold Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg responsible for this deceptive business practice. So this is not a criminal issue. So what I'm going to do here with a couple of your examples is go through and sort of give you, rather than go through the standard issue spotting exercise that we did the first time, is sort of give you a thought process that might go through. So the first is to identify, okay, so identity theft, is that an issue? Well, it's Facebook we're worried about, they weren't the thief. Another area, and this one's tough to explain why without a little background knowledge, so this would basically hopefully require you reading further and realizing this isn't the issue. A couple of people looked at FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and FOIL, which is the Freedom of Information Law in New York. Same idea, federal, state. So FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, basically says people can send requests to the government to get the government and agency, whatever, to release whatever information that government has that is of interest. Journalists do this a lot. Again, this is not an issue of government having information on your client that the government released, either intentionally or inadvertently. The government had nothing to do with this issue. So this would not be a FOIA or a FOIL issue. A couple of you used the term thinking about disclosure because, yes, information about your client was disclosed, which made her very unhappy. So you use the term disclosure, but of course disclosure has a very specialized meaning in the law having to do with discovery, right? When you did civil procedure, and I don't know if any of you are in New York civil practice yet, the idea of, is this discoverable? Can it be disclosed, or does it have to be disclosed to the other side in litigation? Again, this is not a disclosure in terms of a discovery issue, right? This has nothing to do with discovery. It has to do with the common usage of the word disclosure, but not the legal usage of disclosure in discovery. There was at least one person focused on the possible user agreement that Facebook has with, I mean, if any of you still use Facebook, not everybody does anymore, but if you use Facebook, when you first signed up, you had to click some box saying, yes, I agree. And like most people, you maybe didn't read the agreement. And yes, all of these online entities try to have these user agreements be binding, and then there's a whole area of law having to do with whether those click-through user agreements are really binding, because of course nobody reads them or understands them, except the lawyers that draft them, probably. So while Facebook might argue, you signed the user agreement, anything we do is okay, because that's what the user agreement usually says. So that might be one argument that you would have to counter for your client, but it isn't the basis for the entire issue. It's not where you really want to start. Might be something down the road, one of those tangents that you have to go off on to address an argument. But again, you're focusing on deceptive business practice and how that legal concept applies to the facts for your client. So that brings us to what the issue is. And again, deceptive business practice, talking about maybe as it applies to social media, or some of you use the term Facebook as a search term. Usually using a company name isn't a great idea because law isn't built around a company, but of course Facebook is still so prevalent and so huge that actually it might not be such a bad search term because it's frequently used as a stand-in for social media. So again, we're looking at deceptive business practices as it applies to social media, as it applies to personal data, to privacy. All those ideas are in there. Another area, and this is common where folks get confused, is they want to find, especially secondary sources, they want to find the perfect law review article or the perfect treatise or section that has everything in there. So deceptive business practice and social media and privacy and data and all of that. And if it doesn't have that, then it's no good. And you will rarely find the perfect article. And in fact, I design, as you can see from what we discuss in class with regard to ERISA and this problem, I design the problems not to be ones where there's an easy answer. Because we're supposed to be advanced legal research, right? So this is one where you have to do that detective hunt that I talk about and find a little here and a little there and a little there. And sometimes you'll get led down a false path, but then you'll correct yourself and find a better clue. So you want to learn a little bit about deceptive business practices. And you want to learn a little bit of internet law and how the law applies to social media and data and privacy of personal information. And that probably will not all be in one source. It may not be in, you may not find all of that in every source. That's part of what practicing law is about, is sometimes you have to create your own argument from the sources that you find. So a philosophy I have in life that definitely applies to legal research is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. You find something good on deceptive business practices that don't talk about all these specific issues, you definitely want to learn about it. If you find something that talks about social media and holding social media companies accountable, take a look and see how they're held accountable. So take a look at the different aspects. One other area, I've actually answered a couple of questions before class on this, and this is the first time I've run into confusion with this. So what's the difference between search results and best searches, or what your searches are? Your searches are your search terms. So here's an example that I've been using, liability HMO. That's my search. If I were answering the question on the first assignment or the second assignment and asked me what my search is, I would say liability HMO. If I tried a bunch of different searches, I tried one ERISA and preemption and a bunch of other searches, and I decided this one got me the best results, this would be my best search, liability HMO. My search results are what I get down here. So here, limited liability of corporate health maintenance, scrolling down. So I might decide my search results, maybe my best result is liability of health maintenance organizations from American jurisprudence proof of facts. These are my search results. So on assignment 2, I ask you for your best search. That's what your search terms that you type in. I ask you for your best search results. Those are whatever you find, the resources you find. And assignment 2 is going to be statutes. So it'll be code sections. Everybody clear on that? Okay, great. So now we get to move on to legislative history. So the first question we need to ask is, what is it? And legislative history is essentially the documents that are produced leading up to our heroes becoming a law. So our hero starts as a bill, and our hero goes through several steps, and finally at the very end, and he's very lucky, gets signed by the president and becomes a law. So the documents produced in that process. So the next logical question is, why do we care? And actually, let me back up before, that is the next logical question. So legislative history refers to really two things. The first, what I just said, all the documents produced from when a bill is first introduced to it becomes a law. Some people refer to legislative history also as bill tracking. So if a bill is introduced in Congress or introduced in the state legislature, what's happening with that bill? Whether what's happening with that bill that got introduced yesterday or this year, or what happened to a bill that got introduced in 1964. If you want to know what that bill tracking is another aspect of legislative history. We will be spending 95% of the class today talking about the first part of it and a little bit about bill tracking. Okay, so why do we care about all of these documents from when a bill is first introduced till it becomes law? And if you want to answer, that's fine. Otherwise, I will point you to a case. So what we're really talking about when I talk about those documents produced, we're talking about researching the legislative intent. What did Congress or the state legislature mean when they drafted that particular statutory language, right? Those statutes, when you look at those code sections, they have very particular language. What did Congress, again, or the state legislature, mean by that? What was their intention? And again, that same question, why do we care what they meant? And my answer to you is in this many different places, but one of the places I like the best is in this case, Chase Scientific. It doesn't really matter what the case is. I'm scrolling down to particular language because the judge in this case based his or her, I'm not sure which, decision. And here she writes, in 1962, the legislature replaced the 2-year limitations period contained in CPL Act with CPLR 214.6. The revisers noted that the new statutes was added on the suggestion that malpractice, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but what's happening here is that this judge is looking at what the revisers of a statute looked at when they decided on the language of that revision for the statute, which ultimately became law. They were looking at what the documents that the legislature produced as it considered this revision. And so what's exciting here is the legislature amended based on these different documents. The legislature amended and they documented why they did this in these different documents. So I always kind of imagine this Chase Scientific Research Group, and I always like to think some enterprising young associate in whatever firm was representing the winning side did a whole lot of research into legislative intent, which is what we're going to talk about today, and discovered, hey, check this out. In this legislative report, it says that the legislature really meant this when they were revising this statute. And this enterprising associate presented it to the partner who was in charge of the case. Come on in. And that person said, hey, this is a good argument. I'm going to add this to the brief. And sure enough, that was the winning argument. So this is why we care about legislative intent. It is an argument to make when you are making an argument for interpreting a statute a particular way. Will it always win? Of course not. In fact, there is a particular line of thought. Justice Scalia was a proponent of this line of thought. Justice Scalia thought legislative history was a terrible argument. Justice Scalia always wanted to look at the words of the code section itself and not at anything else, the plain meaning of the words. And there are still some proponents of that, but you can see here what Justice Scalia says is the greatest defect of legislative history is its illegitimacy. We are governed by laws, not by the intentions of legislators. And he goes on to quote a court in 1844, the law as it's passed is the will of the majority. But not least of the defects of legislative history, Justice Scalia continues, is its indeterminacy. So again, here be careful when you're making a legislative intent argument, if you plan to do so, because not every judge thinks it's legitimate. None of you will have the opportunity to appear before Justice Scalia anymore, but if you appear before somebody who shares his philosophy, you might run into this kind of argument. So that is what legislative history is. That's why we're going to bother. Let's now dive in and talk about how we find the legislative history. So this is one of the more complex areas of legal research. It's also an area that it's very possible some of you may never have to do. But my guess is in a class of 19 of you, at least a few of you will. And it's also not bad for the rest of you to understand when you're reading a case or something else, what it is that they're referring to. So in order to make this as understandable as I can possibly do, we have a couple of handouts. So the first one is this key to legislative history research. So we are going to basically, these are my notes and can be, as you choose, your notes. If you understand this handout, you understand what you need to know about legislative history. Everybody have one or pass? Anybody else? And what I've done on this key to legislative history handout is I have broken down what you need to understand into 4 steps. So not too bad, I hope, right? 4 steps. So first step, as we see here, understand the legislative process. We will be spending a good amount of time going through that, as well as understanding that the documents that are produced in each of these steps. And part of understanding those documents, I always think half the battle is the first year of law school is understanding the abbreviations. How many of you knew what FSUP was when you were first year? So half the battle, if you understand these abbreviations, you're a good way there with legislative history too. And so I've listed the abbreviations for you on page 5 of the key to legislative history handout. So those are the first 2 steps. Understand the process, understand the documents produced. Then know how to find the all-important public law number. Or state session law number. We actually mostly know how to do this. We'll review it and go over the final step that we haven't gone into detail on. And then know a couple of good sources, some free ones, some that cost some money. And we'll take a look at sources to do this research. Okay. So the way we're going to do that, if you turn the page to page 2 of the key handout, is the key is sort of the overview. And then I have this rather heavy handout. This is another one of my walkthroughs. These are the sample pages. This is just so you can see up close and personal the different documents that we're talking about so you understand what they look like and how they work. And so on the top of the key handout on page 2, I've given you the executive summary, basically the steps of the legislative process. And as I said, this is essentially what happens for our friend, the bill, to become a law. And one of the best, and frankly, my favorite sources for explaining the legislative process is this video. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Maybe your parents showed it to you way back when. But this is not only just a little cute cartoon, which it is, but listen to it for the document's reference, because it actually gives, I truly believe, a really great explanation. You look familiar? Let's cancel it. Okay, so as I said, a little cute, I hope, fun, but it does go through the steps. So let's take a look in a little bit more detail. But pretty much learned what you needed to know from that. Not quite, but close. Okay, so let's dive into the walkthrough handout. So Federal Legislative History, the thicker one. And for those of you who are more graphically inclined, on page 1, there is a picture of the process. Just, at least for some of you, this looks to me like gibberish. I don't get this because I'm not a visual type person. I'm a word type person. But for those of you who are more visual and can follow this, hopefully that will help. But we are going to move on to focusing on the key handout. So our first document, as we already saw, is the bill. As we saw, a bill is introduced. It's either introduced into the House or the Senate. We're talking about federal legislation today. We'll talk about state legislation and legislative history next week. And you can see the different names and stages of bills on page 2. I wouldn't worry too much about these names. Pretty much what you'll run into most frequently is the engrossed or enrolled bill, because that's what is passed by both chambers. So let's go ahead and turn to page 3. So page 3, we see an actual bill. And the way we know it's a bill is by its abbreviation HR. It will either be abbreviated HR, or you take a look back on page 2 of the key handout, or S. HR is for House of Representatives, S is for Senate. Make sense? Yeah. What will happen is some people will get confused, because everybody does. They'll look at HR and they'll think House report, because, right, HR, House report, that does make sense. It is totally logical. It is also wrong. HR, when you see HR and a number, that's a bill. You will save yourself a whole lot of confusion and maybe a little unhappiness if you can just remember that. It's on the list of abbreviations on page 5 in the key handout to help remind you. And you can see on your the walkthrough handout on page 3, I gave you a handy dandy arrow with a note that citation format indicates that this is a bill. Okay, the other thing you want to notice on page 3 of the walkthrough handout is it's HR 2563 of the 107th Congress. You see that just to the left of the HR. Remember, our Congresses are numbered from 1 to 116. So 1 was back in 1789 and 116 is up through today. So 107th is just a little bit early. If we scroll down, if we didn't already know that, 107th Congress happened between 2001 and to the end of 2002. Okay, so as we saw, let's turn to page 4 of the handout, and you'll see what the bill looks like. Hopefully, this looks a little familiar. It looks just like a public law, right? Because that's how public law started, as bills. So you can think of a bill as a baby public law, if that helps you understand it. So it looks just the same. So that's what it looks like on page 4. So as we saw, if the bill is lucky, let's see if I can do this real quick. And so, whoop, nah, I'm not going to bother with this. So if the bill is lucky, it gets referred to committee. And actually gets referred to committee, and then the committees are divided up into subcommittees, and the committees cover different areas. So if we turn to page 5 of the walkthrough, we see that this is our bill has been referred to the Subcommittee on Health, which is part of the Committee on Ways and Means, back in the 107th Congress. Also, I should note this particular bill that we're looking at is an amendment to ERISA, one of the many. Okay, so here's what the beginning of a hearing looks like. And the hearings are essentially what we saw in the video where the congressmen were arguing at each other in the committee room. It's not really arguing so much. If you turn to page 6, what we really have is a somewhat more formal structure. So they took a little artistic license in the video. Hearings will happen at the subcommittee or committee level. You can have people coming to testify, actually live human beings coming to the congressional room, and they testify and they get up and they say what they think. So these are going to be people who have an interest in this legislation or have some expertise in this legislation. As you see on page 6, there may also be submissions for the record, so written testimony, essentially. So turning to page 7 of the walkthrough, we see what oral testimony would look like, and this is essentially what the hearing document is. It's a combination of that written testimony and the oral testimony, which is transcribed. Turning to page 8, and we're still continuing on step 2 in our key handout. So the committee or subcommittee may hold hearings. The committee or subcommittee may also decide, hey, we need more expert analysis. This is a really technical area. So if we're talking about tax or maybe the science of regarding an environmental piece of legislation, the committee may decide we need to get more expert analysis here. So the committee would arrange for that expert analysis, and that expert analysis would be delivered to the committee and become a committee print. You won't see too many prints. Just wanted to show you what it looks like. So we see that on page 8. And notice the abbreviation again, kind of makes sense, I think, PRT. Again, note the Congress numbers. We're in the 107th Congress, so the print is going to be numbered with 107 dash whatever number print it is. And you can see an example of what a print looks like on page 9. This has to do with tax rates, so you can imagine that's pretty technical, right? So here's this particular committee wanted some expert analysis on tax rates. Again, you won't see prints too much. What you will see a whole lot of are the committee reports. So we're now moving on the key handout to step number 3. And notice in step number 3, I have in bold, in italics, committee report. This is usually the best source for legislative intent. So highlight in your notes on your laptop, whatever, put stars, bold, whatever way you use to emphasize in something really important. One of the most important things you want to remember about legislative intent research is look at the committee reports. We'll look more closely at a report in a moment so you see why. And again, remember that abbreviation can be confusing. HR is a bill. HRPT is a report. Sometimes it might be HREP. But don't get confused by HR. Remember, that's a bill. And Senate isn't so confusing. SRPT, SREP. Okay, so let's take a look at the walkthrough on page 10 to see why we think I tell you committee reports are the best source for legislative intent. So essentially what the committee does once it votes on the bill, it will either vote favorably, as our little hero, the bill said, and if it votes favorably, the committee will produce a report saying why it thinks it's a good idea. And what that report usually contains is what the committee thinks, what the committee is trying to accomplish with this legislation. So we see on page 10 the beginning of a report from the Committee on Education and Labor, and it gives us a synopsis of the Employee Benefit Security Act. So now we're back into the legislative history of the original ERISA Act back in 1974. Notice on top we see the report. The number is 93. Again, that's the 93rd Congress. And then 553 is just the number of the report. So when you see a citation to report, you'll see HRPT or HREP, and then a number, that's the Congress dash, another number, that's just the number of the report. Or it might be SRPT. Okay, so on page 10, we see the synopsis. Turning to page 11, the other aspect and one of the main reasons why committee reports are the best source for legislative intent is this section by section analysis. What the committee does is it goes through the entire bill, as it says, section by section, and says why it thinks that section is a good idea. And it even starts off with an overall intent before it gets to the individual sections, as you can see on toward the bottom of page 11 by the heading purposes. So it tells us right up front, the Employee Benefit Security Act is designed to establish minimum standards, etc. So this is why committee reports are the best source for legislative intent, because basically the committee members are telling you why they think it's a good idea. So turning to page 12, we actually see the section by section analysis once it gets to the actual sections. So we see section 101, coverage, and it tells us why it thinks section 101, what it means by section 101. Section 102. Turn to page 12A. And remember, we've been interested in section 514 of the original act because that's the section on preemption. And all it says here, all state laws would be preempted except for those covering plans not subject, etc. Not very informative on intent, right? You're not always going to find explanation. So you're not always going to be able to make a very explicit legislative intent argument in the section by section analysis. It says this section means. You're not always going to get that lucky. That's one reason why you want to check several different reports, if there are more than one report, that have been produced in the course of passing a public law. Any question on committee reports, on their abbreviations, on what they do, on why they are the best source for legislative intent? Okay, let's go back now to the key handout. As you can see, I've got one of them right next to me, so hopefully you're doing the same. On the bottom of page 2, the other thing committees issue are something called committee documents. And yes, I know that's very generic. I don't know why they chose that generic name, but it's a very specific type of document. Again, you won't see these very frequently. They are mostly have to do with presidential messages or having to do with treaties. So again, unless you're doing research on the legislative history or some kind of treaty research, committee documents won't be very important. Okay, let's turn the page. One more time. So as you remember, after, if your bill is lucky enough to get reported out of committee, it then goes to the full chamber. So if it starts in the House of Representatives, it will go to the full House of Representatives. And that the entire body, so the entire House of Representatives, will debate. And you will find those debates in a publication called the Congressional Record. So in your notes, please put debates equal congressional record. You didn't know there was so much math in legal research, right? And the reason for that is sometimes you will see these debates referred to as debates. Sometimes you'll just see it referred to as congressional record, and who's ever saying that will just assume you know that the congressional record equals debates. So the congressional record, and you'll see references to the congressional record either as CR or CONGREC. The congressional record is actually a fairly complex publication. As you can see on page 13, it actually wasn't always called the Congressional way back in the 1800s. It had a bunch of different names. I wouldn't worry about memorizing it. 99% of the time, you'll be dealing with the Congressional record. And I've also listed a little bit of information about the Congressional record and where you find it. Again, most of the time you'll be looking online, so you don't have to worry about this. And you'll see some list of where to find it online toward the bottom of the page. The one somewhat complex aspect of the congressional record you do need to know about, believe it or not, is something as simple sounding as the page numbers, right? Page numbers are page numbers. How hard can that be? Well, somehow the congressional record managed to make it a little more involved than certainly you would probably like. So turn to page 14 on the walkthrough, and you will see the first page of the permanent edition of the congressional record. Permanent edition of the congressional record in its print world looks like that. Pass it around if you're interested. And what you should notice mostly on page 14, which is just the title page of the volume that's going around, is that it covers pages 4153 to 5628. Sounds like regular page numbers, right? Okay, just keep that in mind as we take a look at the permanent edition of the congressional record. And so you can see what the congressional record looks like. Turn to page 15. And we are looking at page 4724, just a regular number, which happened on February 28th, 1974. And it's basically talking about not really a conversation, but different Congress people getting up and stating what they think about this particular measure. So we have Ms. Holtzman stating her ideas, and then for a while Mr. Erlenborn, and then back to Ms. Holtzman, and you can just see it's again a transcript of the debates that happen on the floor of the House of Representatives. Okay, so why am I making such a big deal over page numbers? Turn to page 16. And here we see an example of the daily edition, not the permanent edition that Isabel has, but the daily edition of a congressional record, which looks something like this. Now, this is more recent because we don't have the very old ones from back 1974. This is the daily edition. Daily obviously goes by day, so you see the date August 2nd, 2001. That around? And you will also see the page number on the bottom. And notice the page number has a letter and then numbers. And that's how you tell the difference. If it's just numbers, it's the permanent edition. If it's got letters and numbers, it's the daily edition. Most of the time, you'll get a reference to the daily edition, which is actually good because it will tell you what chamber you're in. H is obviously House of Representatives. S would be Senate. But every now and again, especially for older debates, if for whatever reason someone is citing to an older debate and you don't have a letter in the page number, you have to know it's the permanent edition. So let's go from page 16 to 17. And again, you see the transcript of the debates that happened on August 2nd, 2001 in the House of Representatives. So on page H5214, again, I'm on page 17 of the walkthrough, we see that there is some conversation or really exchange between Ms. Solis, and then after Ms. Solis, Mrs. McCarthy gets up to speak, and then Ms. Kilpatrick gets up to speak. And so this is what happened. Again, we're in the House of Representatives. We know that because it's an page number as well as it tells us on the top. So these are the debates that happen in Congress. And just so you can see an example of what the Senate congressional record looks like. Looks just the same, except it's S page numbers for the daily edition. So again, same date, August 2nd, 2001. We see an S page number. So on the bottom, S 8629. So that's the main thing you want to know about the congressional record. There are a couple of additional types of page numbers in the daily edition that are worth mentioning. I wouldn't worry too much about them. On page 19, we see extension of remarks. And if you look on the top corner, it's actually got an E page number, E1495. I'm looking on page 19 of the walkthrough. These extension of remarks are actually kind of interesting, I think. Basically, senators and congressmen have the opportunity to add comments into the debate after the fact. They can change history. They can go back in time and change history by saying, I really wanted to say this, but I didn't. Or actually on the bottom of page 19, you could see the Honorable Michael G. Oxley says, I was detained from the debate, but I really wanted to say this. So he gets to add it in the extension of remarks and say it. So that's what the extension of remarks are. And so those are E page numbers in the daily edition. And if you turn the page to page 20 of the walkthrough, there's also something called the Daily Digest. Daily Digest appears in the daily edition, not surprisingly. It's sometimes at the end of the daily edition, which I never understood why they did that, because it really should be in the beginning, in my opinion, because it's really just an annotated table of contents. The Daily Digest tells you on what page different things were discussed, and it gives you a sentence description of what was discussed. So if you get a big, thick congressional record that Chrissy is holding, Chrissy, hold up, show everybody how thick no, the daily edition. So you could, if you wanted to find out what was discussed having to do with health, you could thumb through what's probably 100 pages, or you could look at the Daily Digest at the table of contents and find it that way. So that's what the Daily Digest does. And you can see on the bottom right of page 20, the Daily Digest is a D page number. So there's logic to this. So we're looking at D833 on page 20 of the walkthrough. And pages 21 and 22 give you more detail on what you would find in the Daily Digest. So these were a whole lot of pages and a whole lot of explanation. For the congressional record, what you really need to know, 1, congressional record equals debates. That's the most important thing. 2, different pagination depending on which edition you're looking at. Most of the time, you'll probably get daily edition references. That's going to be with a letter and a number. Sometimes you'll get permanent edition. That's just a number. Any questions about the congressional record? Okay. Is that a question? So let's go back to the key handout. So we're on page 3. We just discussed item number 4, the congressional record. Looking at item number 5, if the first chamber passes the bill after the debate, it then goes to the other chamber. So if you remember here in our video, our little guy gets dragged across the Capitol because he's going from the House to the Senate. Now sometimes bills can start in the Senate and then you get dragged from the Senate over to the House. Just depends on which chamber introduced the bill first. And the whole thing starts over again. So the whole thing being bill gets referred to committee and subcommittee. Subcommittee holds hearings. So those hearings get published. So we've got bill, hearings. If the committee votes to report favorably, they then create a committee report. Again, remember, committee report, the best source for legislative intent. And then it goes to the second chamber for debate. So if it started in the House, the second chamber would be the Senate. The Senate debates in the congressional record, and the congressional record would have S pages for the daily edition. So those are the 4 steps. So moving from, on the key handout, from step 5 to step 6, once the measure goes through both the House and Senate, and if it passes both chambers, remember it has to pass both chambers. Think about it. You've got a whole lot of people, 400, right? 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. Probably those versions are going to get changed and may be different. So the version that passed in the House may be very or only a little or somewhat different than the version passed in the Senate. So then what happens? They have to meet in what's called a conference committee. So the conference committee will meet. So there'll be people, the House will appoint a few people, the Senate will appoint a few people, senators and congressmen. They'll meet together and hopefully they'll hash out their differences and come up with a single measure that both chambers can vote and agree on. And if that happens, and only if that happens, we get something called a conference report. And you can see that again on the key handout. We're at number 6. So it goes to the conference committee when the versions are different, and hopefully they can reconcile those versions. Sometimes all of the negotiation happens in the conference committee. If you think about it, in the political situation we're in now, where the House is controlled by the Democrats, the Senate's controlled by the Republicans, if they're considering the same measure, they're very likely going to be very different, right? Because they've got different political philosophies. So when it gets to the conference committee, they could be quite different. An example where this happened, where actually the entire measure got negotiated in the conference committee, was actually in the tax legislation that got passed a couple of years ago. It turned out the conference committee pretty much created, they debated, the conference committee discussed and came up with a version that both chambers could agree on. And what this committee did with the tax measure is they created what's called a conference report. And we can see an example of it, not the tax example, but one having to do with ERISA, back on page 23 of the walkthrough. So what gets a little bit confusing about conference reports is, first, it's called a report. So just like committee report, it is also a report, but it's a report of the conference committee as opposed to a subcommittee of either the House or the Senate. It will frequently have the same abbreviations, either HRPT or SRPT or REP. And the numbering's the same, excuse me, again. So you see up top on the right, 93-1280, 93 is the 93rd Congress, and 1280 is just the number of the report. But we see very clearly on page 23 that this is indeed a conference report. And that the bill that they considered was HR, remember HR is a bill, HR number 2. So typically a conference report will discuss just those areas of disagreement. If, as with the tax example, the whole thing is disagreed upon, and then the whole conference report will cover everything. Okay, and you can see what a conference report looks like on page 23A. So it's talking about the differences. The House bill requires annual reporting. The Senate bill requires submission of comparable. The conference substitute adopts the reporting format. So it's basically saying one side said this, one side said that. We're going to do this version. And so they're basically saying what they agreed on. Turn to page 24. And interestingly, because we have, again, the discussion of where the areas there were disagreement, it turns out that section 514, our preemption section, was one of those sections. So actually in the conference report, we get a whole lot more explanation about what the legislatures had in mind when they decided upon the language of 514. So if we wanted to make a legislative intent argument, we would want to find this conference report because this would have a whole lot of information of what they intended with regard to preemption. Now you have to read and see if it supports your argument or not. Obviously, you don't want to make the argument if it doesn't support your client, but so you want to, so again, reports, both regular committee reports and conference committee reports are going to be the best sources for legislative intent. And you want to check, if it exists, you definitely want to check the conference report, but it may not discuss your issue, so you also want to check the regular committee reports as well that are relevant for your issue, for your client. Any questions about conference reports? Okay, so moving on our key handout, we're at step 6. We're now moving to step 7. The House and Senate agree upon a version. The bill goes to the president for his signature. And that, of course, is my favorite slide right here. So, assuming the president signs and does not veto, then we have a law. And what the president does, the last document produced, is a presidential signing statement. And as you can see on the key handout, we find this in something called either the weekly compilation of presidential documents. These days, because it's online, it can be a daily compilation of presidential documents, or sometimes it's just referred to as compilation of presidential documents. Hopefully the name is pretty straightforward and you're not going to worry about the time period too much because there's no need. And to see what this looks like, turn to page 25. So we're looking at the ERISA presidential signing statement in the weekly compilation. So on page 25. And turning to page 26 on the right-hand side, you see the signing statement from President Ford at the time of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. And so here's what President Ford had to say about that on pages 26 and 27. Usually the presidential signing statement isn't going to give us much insight into legislative intent, right? Because it's the presidential signing statement. But what has happened in some presidential administrations is they've had the idea, hey, wait a minute, I want to have my say in legislative intent because presidents know that lawyers look to argue legislative intent. And there's this whole area, a theory really called the unitary executive theory, and I'm way oversimplifying it, that promotes this idea of the president inserting his ideas of what the legislation should mean. So presidential signing statements aren't meaningless. They're probably less important for the most part. Certainly less important than committee reports. Okay. And so, of course, we end up with our public law. So this is why I suggested to you way back in your statute screencast, I don't know how many weeks ago, that we were starting with episodes 4 through 6, because we were starting with statutes, right? So now in legislative history, we've looked at episodes 1 through 3. If we're going with the Star Wars analogy. I'm not going to push that too hard, but it kind of works, right? Well, okay, you can humor me or not as you see fit. So we are now back at the public law, which means on our key handout, we have, hopefully, now have an understanding of the legislative process, item number 1, and we understand the documents produced in each step of the legislative process and recognize their abbreviations, step 2. So as we see on the executive summary, bill, hearings, committee report, debates equals congressional record. Goes over to the other chamber, not really a document, but possibly same documents from the other chamber. Then we have a conference report, presidential signing statement, public law. Does that make sense? Okay, in honor of that, let's take a break and come back at 5:15. So we're now going to go to Roman numeral 3 of our key to understanding legislative history, and that is knowing how to find the all-important public law number. Now, in truth, we already know much of this. We went over when we first got introduced to statutes. So I will review and then go into slightly more detail that you need to know. Again, the highlights are on the key handout, but we'll take a look at the walkthrough for the details. So starting on page 28, we're looking at the USCA. So we're looking at the print version of the code. We'll take a look at Westlaw and Westlaw on how to do this in a moment. Typically, when you're doing legislative intent research, so again, when you're trying to find what Congress meant regarding the language of a particular code section, you'll be starting with the code section, right? Makes sense? So in our case, we're starting with section 29 USC 1144. If we want to know what did Congress mean by particular language in section 1144. So if we are looking at section 1144 in print, we might be looking at the U.S. Code annotated. Again, we'll look at Westlaw in just a moment. So here's good old 1144 on page 29. Turning to page 30, we see the parenthetical after the section. Remember, that's my name for the print. Anybody remember what we call it on Westlaw? Heard it? Credits, thank you. And anybody remember on Lexis? History, excellent. Oh, you guys are good. So in print, it's the parenthetical after the section. I know, not a very good name, but if you have another one, I'm all for it. So this is how we find the all-important public law number, is looking at that parenthetical. So looking at that parenthetical with my handy-dandy arrow right there, what's the public law number that enacted section 1144? 93,406. And 93,406, what section in 93,406 enacted the code section 1144? 514. Everybody following Chrissy's logic, which is excellent. And the date it was passed? Excellent, thank you, Jenny. And the statutes at large site. Remember, STAT stands for statutes at large. Somebody else? I gave you most of the answer already. 88, volume 88, statutes at large. Page 897. Actually, 897 is where we would find section 514, not where it would start. Okay, and what does that semicolon mean? Everybody? Everybody? And amended by. This is why I emphasize this, because now you understand where to find that all-important public law number. So it's and amended by this next Pub L, 97,473, which if we follow through on the second line, is it 1983? And then after that semicolon, amended yet again by another public law, 98. Excellent, 397 and 84. And there are what, about a dozen of these public laws, right? Do we want to do legislative history for a dozen public laws? Well, I'm with you, Menashe. Absolutely. No, thank you very much. So how can we figure out which public laws we want to check? And here's the part that I answered briefly to Luke's question. Very excellent question. I think it was last week. And that's using the historical and statutory notes. And you can see by my handy-dandy arrow which sections each amendment affected to help you determine which public law number to use. And please, if you would, on page 30 of the walkthrough, it should read which public law numbers, plural, so add a little S, because sometimes you may have to check more than one. Hopefully you won't have to check all dozen or so. In fact, rarely, if ever. It's not quite that simple. And this is one reason why I like to show you the print first, because if you want to understand how it works in the print and see it, hopefully it'll make more sense when you look at it online. And by all of that's an introduction to page 31 of the walkthrough, because you want to look at the amendments section of the historical and statutory notes. So I'm going to ask you to add a handy-dandy arrow, I should have done that, to the word amendments on page 31 in the left-hand column. just above the 2006. So you want to go to historical statutory notes, and then you want to go to the amendment section of the historical and statutory notes. And by the way, your key handout says all this. And in the amendment section, as we look at it on page 31, it's basically telling us in reverse chronological order, starting with the most recent amendment, 2006, what it did. So Public Law 109-280, in section 902 of that public law, added subsection E. So if our language that we were interested in looking for the legislative intent was section E, we actually wouldn't look at 93-406 at the first public law that enacted it, because subsection E didn't exist back then. Subsection E didn't exist until 2006, when ERISA was amended and they added it, right? Laws evolve over time. Congress changes it, and sometimes they add stuff, sometimes they take stuff out, sometimes they just change the wording. So this is where you would look to figure out which public law, if any, affected your language. If you don't see any amendment that affected your language, probably it was enacted with the original public law. So if you don't see your language in any of these amendments, then you'd probably want to go to the first one, 93-406. Vanessa, you're looking pained. Okay. Does that make sense? This is in the weeds. I'm going to give you that. This is why people find legislative history to be a little bit more complex. But if you're doing this kind of research, knowing these little tricks, you're going to save the day from having to check 12 or more different public laws. Now, of course, we're in the print, so we need to update, and check the pocket part, turning to page 32, and really page 33. If there was any text in the pocket part, you would see the public laws responsible for that text. But because there have been no changes to 1144 from the main volume, we don't see anything in the pocket part. Probably this isn't going to be an issue for you all because you'll be looking online one way or the other. Speaking of which, let's do exactly that and see what all of this looks like online, where you'll most likely be looking. So here on Westlaw, we've already determined it's the credits, where we find our all-important public law numbers, and other than the word credits, it looks just like it did in print. Everybody agree? Whoops. Yes, let's extend our session. And I point out on the walkthrough on page 34, I'm showing you the credits, just what we're looking at here on the screen. And I'm pointing out the enacting public law. That's going to be very important. Again, if none of the amendments discuss your language, that's where you'll go. And I only point out the last amending public law again because we talked about that whole updating issue. If there are changes, you'll want to know when the last public law was to see if there are updates. Remember, we were looking at 2611, and there was a public law that was passed at the very end of 2019 that's not reflected in the parenthetical that we were looking at. So don't worry so much about the last amending public law unless you notice those flags in Westlaw up top. Or actually, Lexis had a note too. But what you do want to worry about on Westlaw are those historical and statutory notes, right? Because Menashe, we don't want to check all 12 laws. Absolutely. So we want on Westlaw to go to history and to go to editor and reviser's notes. And again, I mentioned this in the key handout. It's just something you need to remember. Or look back on your handy walkthrough, and you'll see on page 35 that picture. So we go to history, do the drop down, editor and reviser's notes, and then we scroll down on the bottom portion of the page. That's step 1. Step 2, on the bottom half of the page, scroll down to amendments. So I'm going to scroll down to amendments. And again, this is exactly what we saw in the print, just on Westlaw. And we see again, if we were interested in subsection E, Public Law 109-280. So if we were to identify, so hypothetically, if we decided that this substitution providing directory in that subsection A, if we decided, oh, that's of interest, all we would do on Westlaw, and this is the advantage of Westlaw certainly over the print, say, okay, click on that public law, and let Westlaw do its thing. So you can see that example on page 36 of the handout. We're still in editor and reviser's notes. I clicked on the public law of interest. And then step 2, I choose the legislative history materials tab when looking at public law. So when I'm looking at the public law, this legislative history materials tab brings me to a list of those documents that we just discussed. So there are a whole bunch of prints in here because this has to do with tax, I think. Remember, prints have to do with expert analysis. But here we scroll down, we see some reports. And we see congressional record. Congressional record equals debates. Remember our math and legal research. So there are a whole bunch of congressional record. And then testimony. On Westlaw, for whatever reason, they call hearings testimony. I don't know why. And then we have something called compiled history. Basically, the single source pulled together all these documents. The advantage to that is that you can click on these different parts and then do Control F to do term searches. Otherwise, you would have to click, if you wanted to look at the reports, you would have to click on every single individual report. I'll review this again later on. But since we're looking at Westlaw, I thought I would show you how it worked. On Lexis. Again, a little bit of wash, rinse, repeat, as I like to say. As we already reviewed, our all-important public law is located in the history on Lexis. On Lexis, if we want to find which public law, we would, whoops, what did I do? Nothing. We would just scroll down to the amendments. Actually, on Lexis, they now call them amendment notes. I think they just changed that name like a couple of weeks ago. So instead of amendment, it's amendment notes, and on Lexis, it's in chronological order rather than reverse chronological order. Again, don't ask me why, but you read through and find out in 83 what the Act in 83 did, and in 84 what the law in 84 did. Any questions about Lexis? Now turning to page 38A, Lexis, in my humble opinion, is not at all good for legislative history research. It can get you to the individual documents, but unless you've already identified those documents or identified which type of document even, it's really hard to find legislative intent on Lexis. Now, I'm sure our Lexis rep will be very unhappy to hear me tell you that, but it's what I believe. So what I have given you on page 38A is the list of legislative history research. Actually, it's a handout from Lexis. And as you see, you just see a bunch of links for the different types of documents. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about legislative history research on Lexis because, as I said, I don't think it works very well. And I'm actually going to show you a free site that I think is better. So even if you're at a place that only has Lexis, we'll talk about this free site that I think will work much better for you. So we talked about how to find the all-important public law number. The parenthetical, right? Either called credits on Westlaw, history on Lexis, just the parenthetical at the end of the section for the print. We've talked about the amendments in the editor and reviser's notes to figure out which all-important public law number or numbers we need to check. On your key handout, remember, if we're not starting with a code section, because I'm presuming we're starting with a code section, which is what's going to happen, I think, probably 95% of the time. For the other 5%, if you have a popular name, remember the popular name table will tell us the all-important public law number, and that Table 3 translation tool at the House of Representatives site. And those links are available for you here on the key handout as well as the course website. And in fact, all of these websites that I'm going to go to now are all available on the course website in the legislative history module. Okay, so step 1, understand the process. Check. And documents, check. Right, let's make sure I've got these steps right. Oh, step 1, understand the legislative process. Step 2, understand the documents produced and abbreviations. Check, yes. Step 3, know how to find the all-important public law number. We'll talk about state session law next week. Can we say check on all-important public law number? Okay, step 4, know 1 or 2 good sources, both for free and those that cost money. So I am going to show you the one that costs the most money, but is the best resource. We have it here at Hofstra, yay. And so should you be around in the neighborhood and need to do some legislative intent research, please come and visit us, because you can sit at one of our public workstations and use the site called Legislative Insight. Now, as I said, this link is available on the legislative history module. But of course, once this course is done, you won't have the course website anymore. So you will want to know to go to the Law Library homepage and remember our Find Research Guide and online resources. And if you search for Legislative Insight, it's also called ProQuest Legislative Insight, so don't get confused. ProQuest is just the company that makes this database. So if you search for Legislative Insight, you will get the link to view Legislative Insight, and that will bring you, if all goes well, or bring me, if all goes well, to ProQuest Legislative Insight. So what's so wonderful about ProQuest Legislative Insight? The library pays a whole lot of money for this, and the reason we do that is because it pulls all the documents together. So once you have that all-important public law number, which is why I keep on saying that, once you have that all-important public law number, it pulls all the documents together for you, and the beautiful thing, it's full-text searchable. This is a new thing. When I taught this class 10 years ago, this was not a thing. You could not full-text search all of the documents that were produced to create a public law number, or create a public law. So how is that done? And your handout, your walkthrough handout starting on page 39 shows you. So if we have our all-important public law number, so 93406 is what enacted ERISA. So I type that in, and what Legislative Insight does is it populates these other boxes. I didn't type this. All I typed in was 93406, and I go to legislative history. So, as I said, the one wonderful thing it does, I don't have to go find all these documents like I would clicking on all those links on Lexis, or even just scrolling through Westlaw. Westlaw pulled them all together for me. I can scroll through, so I see the different bills that were introduced. And this is all, again, what we just discussed. So there are a whole lot of related bills, but what Legislative Insight will also tell us is which was the enacted bill. So we know that the enacted bill was 93, that's the Congress, HR, remember that's abbreviation for bill, and 2, that's the bill number. So HR 2. So we've got all the related bills that got introduced. And then it goes to the congressional records. Congressional records equals somebody? Debates, beautiful. Congressional records equal debates, debates equal congressional records. Either one is correct. And it gives us the reports for our public law. And if you scroll down a little bit further, there'll be hearings. In fact, I don't have to do all this scrolling. I can just go to a publication type. So I can go to the reports, I can go to the hearings. And at the very end, it doesn't list, it's interesting, I never noticed this. It doesn't list it in the drop-down menu, but at the very end, oh, I'm wrong. Somewhere in here, it lists the presidential message. But actually, that's pretty hard to find, so don't worry about it. As I said, that's not the important part of a legislative history anyway. But you can find the important part, which is, anybody remember? The best source for legislative intent? Beautiful, committee reports. So I can go directly to report and I can see the different reports. So I can decide. So Committee on Education Labor, is that going to be a topic that I think is going to be of interest? If my issue is education and labor, possibly. So they're different committees. So labor and public welfare. So you would, so for instance, for our client, I would probably not look at the Committee on Finance report because it's not really a finance issue. So that's how you would find the reports. But as I said in the classic, but wait, there's more. Turning to page 40, we see that it is full text searchable. So if I search, now notice here, find terms in full text publications is the lower box. Find terms on this page is the top box. I want that lower box for the full text searching. So I type in my term, and notice I've typed in preempt and a little star. What's the star? Truncation, open-ended. That's a good way to think about it. So I get preempt, preempted, preemption, etc. And how do I know it's a star? I went to help and learned it. Exactly. And so here, where we see these orange boxes are the different documents that have my term. So I'm going to check reports first, right? And what Legislative Insight does is it guesses for me which are the most important by giving them stars. I can go with Legislative Insight's guess. Not a bad thing to do. I can also, and oh, I should also mention what I've done here is I've used the filter show only publications that match full text. So actually, let me walk you quickly through the process. So once I find my public law, if I want to do the full text search, I type in my search. I'm going to use the star, which I learned from help. I'm going to click on go. And tip, begin your research with reports marked with stars. So notice I'm not the only one saying reports are the best place to start. Legislative Insight is as well. So I might scroll down to the reports marked with star, or I'll just navigate down to reports, or I'm going to limit because I don't really care about the other documents that don't have my term, and I'm just going to only show pubs matching full text search. And then I can go down to report, and here are the ones with star. I might take their advice and start with those. And the other nice thing that Legislative Insight does is it gives me a little note. So it's actually telling me this one's a conference report. Actually, both of these are conference reports. So there are two conference reports. That's interesting because we have an HRPT 93-1280 and we have an SRPT 93-1090. So I would check out one of those reports. And I already downloaded one, so you don't have to watch it download because it takes a while. And I know this is a little bit small, but once I'm in the report, I can do Control F, or I think it's Command F on the Mac, and I can search for my term. So this is how Legislative Insight allows me to do keyword searching. Now, I already know that term is in there because Legislative Insight told me it was, but now to actually find the occurrence of that term in the document, I need to know the Control F or Command F trick. So, yeah, question.
If you had done the truncation method for when you first searched it, if you don't know which version of the word you want to search, I guess my question is, you just search the version of the word and you're actually in the document.
So, because the way you mean the Control F?
Yeah.
So in this case, because all of those versions start with PREEMPT, I just search that and it'll pick it up. So for instance, I know you can't see it, but this occurrence is actually preemption. So it's just highlighting the letters I searched. So it's a very literal search. So if I were searching for liability, but I also wanted libel, and remember it's that E problem, I might just search LIAB.
There's a chance
Yes, it's not perfect. It depending on your word, you may be going through a whole lot. Actually, just out of curiosity, it doesn't tell you, it gives you the documents that have your term, but it doesn't tell you what page. So you're kind of stuck. Some documents have a table of contents in the beginning, so that might help. Believe me, it's way better than nothing. Back in the bad old days when you couldn't do any of the searching, you just have to look at every document and figure it out without any searching. So this is a huge improvement. Great question. Any others? Okay. So that's one great source if you have it available. You're welcome to come back and visit us anytime to use Legislative Insight. But if you are further afield and that's not practical, one other possibility is to check with a law library in your vicinity. A lot of academic law libraries do allow attorneys to come use their resources. We do that for non-alum as well. So that's a possibility for you as well. Next best source is Hein Online. Also is a fee-based database, but a lot more common than Legislative Insight. It's a lot less expensive for one reason. Hein Online is a second best alternative because it doesn't have all public laws. Legislative Insight has all public laws going back to 1789. Hein Online only has compiled legislative histories for a select number of laws. It's a lot, but it's not every single one. So here on the Hein Online homepage, and as you can see on page 42 of your walkthrough, we would go to U.S. Federal Legislative History Library. And I would go to the title collection. And again, we could look by publication title, but I'm never sure if the publication title is going to just be the name of the act, or if I don't know the name of the act, I can always use my all-important public law number. I can also look by popular names, so you have a little bit of flexibility here. Actually, on Legislative Insight, you could also search by popular name, but the all-important public law number is far more reliable. So if I use the all-important public law number on Hein Online, it's being slow. Let's see. So actually, if you turn to page 3 while we're reading, there we go. Again, it's listing the Congress number. Since we know how to read public law numbers, we know 93406 tells us it's the 93rd Congress. So I tell Hein Online that. And then within the 93rd Congress, it's just numerical, so I scroll down to 406. And what I see on Hein Online sometimes is a couple of options. So here I see a compiled legislative history that's 22 volumes and one that's 3 volumes. I'll probably go with the 22 volumes because it's more complete, right? And then I have this search box here, which will allow me to search all 22 volumes. And all of this is pictured on pages 43, 44, and actually 45, where we are now. So if I type in preemption, so what I just showed you on the screen is what's in your handout so that you can refer back. If I type in preemption, and again, I'd want to check the Hein Online help to see what the truncation is. I think it's also a star, but anyway, let's go with what we have. Hein Online is slow, and so Hein Online will show me the different pages. So actually, this is a little bit better, Dolores. This actually gets me to the page preemption, so I don't have to worry about the Control F. So that's one slight advantage to Hein Online. And so here are the different occurrences. And then on Hein Online, but remember, I want to go with committee reports first, right? So on Hein Online, I have to know on the left here to go to section type, show more, and then to highlight House reports, and if there are any Senate, and the House reports and the Senate reports. And it's a little tricky to do sometimes. So that's on pages 46 and 47. So Hein Online, before we got Legislative Insight, Hein Online was the best choice, but now that we have Legislative Insight, it's much better, I think. So the free site. Oh, any questions on Hein Online before I go to the free site? The free site is congress.gov. So congress.gov does a whole lot of things. We'll actually come back to it for bill tracking, but for now, for legislative intent research, again, we want to have our all-important public law number, so we would choose the public laws option here on the right. You can see that on page 48. So you see it brings you to the listing of public laws for the most recent Congress, which we're still in the 116th. So I use the drop-down pictured on page 49 to go to my preferred Congress, which is, of course, 93rd, and that's as far back as congress.gov goes. So again, it's free. You don't get as much for free as you do for pay. And then it lists all the public laws in reverse number order. So if I go to 93,406, just scrolling down to the number, what we see. So I want to click on the link here, which is actually the bill number link, but that brings me to what happened to HR2, which was the bill that ultimately, as you can see here, became law. So what you're looking on the screen is what is on page 50. So what Congress does is it tells us, okay, it gives us the steps of what happened with Public Law 93-406. We know it became law because it's a public law. We see the highlights here, the overview, and it doesn't give us any links though. And that's because this is an older public law. If we were to look at a newer public law, then we would have links to some of the reports. So we would have to track down those reports another way. It also gives us the actions, so it tells us what happened. So it might give us a little more detail about different reports in addition to what's listed up here. And this is just the actions all review. If I go to the all actions, it gives me more detail. So congress.gov isn't nearly as good as Hein Online or Legislative Insight, but it's better than nothing. And it's at least identifying for us the important committee reports. Yes, we would have to try to find them elsewhere. How you'd find them elsewhere, depending on what you have available to you, maybe Lexis, maybe Westlaw, Google them certainly. Ask your favorite reference librarian. There are any number of ways to find these reports, even the older ones. So on congress.gov, again, you would see links for newer public laws, and this action tabs can be very useful as well. Questions on congress.gov? So I will review Westlaw again. I already showed it to you, but that was in the earlier pages, so you already have that. So looking at Westlaw, so if you are in your code section, so I'm here at 1144, we would of course go to our And again, this is review. We already talked about this. I would go to editors and revisers notes to figure out which all-important public law I wanted. Scroll down to amendments. I would read through the amendments. If I determined, ooh, this one looks good, I would click on that public law number. And then once at that public law number, if I go to legislative history materials, this lists for me the different documents that Westlaw has available. So I would scroll down to reports and check out the reports. If I'm really lucky, I would scroll all the way down to the bottom and see compiled legislative history. So I could click on that compiled and do the Control F search that way, or I can do it for the individual reports. And that's really up to you. Excuse me, whichever works, whichever you prefer. So I might click through, this is what, a half a dozen reports, so that's not too bad. Now what's likely going to happen, let's go back. You will start at, oh, let's just go back this way. So what some folks do is you start in your code section, because again, that's usually where you want to start where you will start your research with legislative intent, because your question will be, what does the language in this code section means? And you will see history, and you'll say, oh, cool, legislative history materials. Now I haven't clicked on any public law. I'm at the code section. And this is where people get confused. So I'm hoping to maybe reduce a little bit of that confusion. I'm going to get all of the different public laws that created 1144 from 93-406, the very beginning in 1974, through the most recent amendment in 2006. And so this is a whole lot more to scroll through. So you still have to know your all-important public law number, and then you have to scroll to find it. It's not that you can't do it this way. This isn't wrong. It's just a little bit more confusing, in my opinion. So if you are looking for something, you will be getting an assignment on legislative history. And if you are doing that and you're getting confused, of course, come ask, but try to remember the difference. Okay, so that's legislative history on Westlaw, which is the, I guess, I don't know, maybe equal, maybe slightly better than Congress.gov, in my opinion. Fine Online and definitely Legislative Insight, to me, the best. There's one other print source, and the only reason I'm showing you this is not to say you should do research in the print source, but you're going to see references to it. So in my view, it's good for you to understand what it's referencing. And that's our good friend UScan on page 51. In judicial opinions, in other types of materials, you'll see cites to UScan. And frequently, it will be citing to committee reports. So if you remember way back when we started statutes, our hero, the public law, could live on two different planets. Statutes at large, the official, UScan, U.S. Code, Congressional News, again, I'm not saying that again, UScan was the second. And so we already saw what we're looking at on page 51 for 1974. Volume 1 is the laws volume. And page 52 is what we already saw, which is the table of contents for 93-406. Here's that same volume. If you all want to do some weightlifting, I'll pass it around. Notice on top, I didn't highlight this the first time we went through, but notice on top underlined, for legislative history of Act, see page 4639. UScan actually does two things. It is the planetary home of public laws, and that's what we saw in our first screencast, and that's the volume that's going around now. That's volume 1 for 1974. UScan also does a second thing. It reproduces selected committee reports, and it does that in the later volumes, 2, 3, 4. There's usually not more than 4, but if there is. So I am holding volume 3, and what volume 3 says on the bottom is legislative history. Emily, look at the spine. And on the bottom, what does it say? Just above that. Okay, so that's the black part, right? So I'm reading from the black part. That says laws. That means public laws. I'm reading the black part. It says legislative history. That means committee reports for those laws. Again, you will see citations to 1974 USCAN, USC CAN, and then some page number. It's probably somebody citing to a committee report. So I shall pass around volume 3. You can take a look at the bottom to see the distinction. And turn from page 52 to page 53. And actually, I'm going to back up a moment to page 53. I got so excited I got ahead of myself with volume 3 of USCAN. Back in the laws volume, in volume 1, a lot of public laws in their first section or two might have a section that says finding and declaration of policy or purpose or intent or reasons why we think this is such a great idea. Now, they probably won't say that, but something along those lines. So in the text of the public law, you will sometimes get an indication of what the overarching intent, the overarching hope of what Congress is trying to achieve. You can maybe make a policy argument by saying, look, Section 2, Public Law 93-406, Congress is saying what it's trying to do with this ERISA Act. So that's another sort of broader way of making a legislative intent argument, is that those early findings and declaration of policy type sections. So that's in the public law itself. Now back to volume 3, where we have the committee reports to the public laws that are in volume 1 and 2. On page 54, we see volume 3, the title page of volume 3, and you see the reference to the page that we had, 4639, is on page 55 of the walkthrough. And we see that the House and Senate reports and the House conference report are set out. So if we were to turn the pages after 4639, we would find those reports. And again, I'm not suggesting you try to find the reports in USCAN and figure out is it volume 2, is it volume 4. I'm saying when you see a reference in a case or in a secondary source that's saying some year USCAN, you now know it's either a law or it's a committee report reprinted in the later volumes. That's all I'm going to say about USCAN. Any questions? Actually, I'll say one more thing about USCAN. You can also find it on Westlaw. Again, I don't know how often you will use it, but occasionally in your search, if you do pull up USCAN in Westlaw, you will now know what it is. And that really is all I will say about USCAN. Questions on sources for doing legislative intent. We looked at a couple of ones that cost money, Legislative Insight being the best one, Heinemann being second best, free one, Congress.gov, Westlaw also costs money, but not quite as good as the first two, in my humble opinion. Okay, so last aspect of legislative history. Remember I said we'd spend 95% on legislative intent, so now's the 5% on bill tracking. If there is a bill introduced and you want to know what's going on with that bill, or you read about a bill that was introduced and you don't know if it ever became a public law back in the past, there are a couple of ways of doing that. Personally, I actually think the free ways are better. You can do it on Lexis, you can do it on Westlaw. There's something called bill tracking, but first of all, it's frequently not in your plan, so it might cost extra money. And as I suggested, I actually think these two sites are much better. Congress.gov, we've already been there. We were looking, remember, at the public laws. We can also look at what's happening with current legislation, or we can go back to all legislation. And they're all different ways. You can see there's a whole lot of stuff on this page in terms of legislative activities. So we could search for a particular bill, or we could look at if there's one that we know that we're of interest. So if we were interested in HR 3 in the current Congress, we could see what's happened. So it was introduced and it was passed by the House. And there are actually all these reports that were issued in the House. So remember I said more recent legislation has links to the House, to the reports. Here you can see an example of that. We can look at the actions that happened in the House. Now I say in the House because we know from this overview that it only got that far. It may have been I don't even know that it was introduced in the Senate. Again, we're in a situation where the House is controlled by the Democrats and the Senate's controlled by the Republicans, so they're not going to agree on a whole lot. So it could be that there are all these bills that the House is going to pass that the Senate won't consider, and vice versa. Anyway, that's a little bit of politics mixed in. But back to finding bill tracking. So here we can see what happened to this particular bill. The other, as well as the step-by-step activity in the Actions tab. So again, this is the Actions overview. If you want all actions, just click on it. The other site I like because it allows you to sign up and get alerts. If you're really interested in following a particular piece of legislation, this govtrack.us is really neat. So here you see the Get Alerts option, and you can click through and sign yourself up for alerts, but this follows legislation that's currently being considered or that has recently been considered. So two really good sources for bill tracking. Any questions on bill tracking? Okay. We are going to stop and